History's most inbred men, the dark side of royal bloodlines. You cannot close your mouth. No matter how hard you try, your jaw hangs slack, drool pooling at the corners of your lips. Your tongue fills your mouth like something foreign, something that doesn't belong to you. When you look in the mirror, you barely recognize the face staring back. Pale, waxy skin stretched over bones that seem arranged all wrong. You are 38 years old, but your body tells the story of something far older, far more broken. You are dying, and you know exactly why. Before we descend into this haunting chapter of history, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? It genuinely amazes me that we can explore these buried truths together, connected across continents by nothing but curiosity about what really happened in the shadows of the past. The year is 1700. The man in the mirror is Charles II of Spain, and he represents the catastrophic endpoint of humanity's most extreme genetic experiment. For 16 generations, his family married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, sometimes even closer, all in the name of keeping their bloodline pure. They called it preserving divine right. They called it maintaining Habsburg heritage. What they created was a human being so genetically damaged that his existence became a warning written in flesh and bone. But Charles wasn't the first, and the Habsburgs weren't alone. Long before European monarchs turned inbreeding into dynasty policy, ancient rulers had already discovered what happens when power refuses to share its blood with the outside world. From the sun-scorched temples of Egypt to the marble palaces of Spain, the pattern repeated itself with horrifying consistency: isolation, concentration, deterioration, collapse. This is the story of men born into cages made of their own ancestry, rulers who inherited empires along with genetic time bombs that had been ticking for centuries. Their suffering was invisible to most, hidden behind royal portraits and official propaganda, but the evidence survived. In medical records, in diplomatic correspondence, in the desperate testimonies of court physicians who watched their kings struggle with the simplest human functions. The Egyptian foundations, when gods married gods. 3,000 years before Charles II struggled to chew his food, Egyptian pharaohs had already perfected the art of royal inbreeding. But they didn't see it as a problem. They saw it as religious necessity. The pharaoh wasn't merely a ruler. He was a living god, and divine blood could not be diluted with mortal lineage. So brother married sister, father sometimes married daughter, creating bloodlines so concentrated that modern geneticists still study them with a mixture of fascination and horror. Akhenaten ruled Egypt around 1353 BCE, and from the moment archaeologists uncovered his statues, they knew something was profoundly different about this king. His face was impossibly elongated, as if someone had taken a normal human skull and stretched it like clay. His neck was thin and unnaturally long. His body presented a bizarre contradiction: thin limbs supporting a torso with pronounced breasts, and a distended belly that made him appear pregnant. For decades, historians debated whether these were artistic choices, stylized representations of divine transcendence. Then DNA analysis provided the answer. This was what extreme inbreeding looked like. Modern medical experts believe Akhenaten suffered from multiple genetic disorders. Craniosynostosis would explain his elongated skull, a condition where skull bones fuse too early, forcing the brain to grow in abnormal directions. Aromatase excess syndrome would account for his feminine body characteristics, a genetic condition that converts male hormones to female ones. These weren't separate afflictions. They were the compound effect of generations of siblings producing children with siblings, concentrating harmful recessive genes with each successive generation. Akhenaten's response to his condition reveals something heartbreaking about the psychology of genetic suffering. He revolutionized Egyptian religion, abandoning the traditional pantheon of gods and declaring that only Aten, the sun disk, deserved worship. Historians have long debated his motives. Was it genuine spiritual revelation, political calculation, or something else entirely? Modern psychiatrists suggest another possibility: that his genetic damage affected not just his body, but his mind. creating the kind of obsessive, reality-detached thinking that sometimes accompanies severe inbreeding depression. He married his sister Nefertiti, as tradition demanded. But he also married his own daughters, Meritaten and Ankhesenamun, in unions that pushed the boundaries of genetic tolerance past the breaking point. The children from these marriages were so damaged that none survived to adulthood. The archaeological record shows infant burials, tiny mummies bearing visible deformities, evidence that the royal bloodline had become incompatible with life itself. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, he left behind a religious revolution that would be violently reversed, and a son whose genetic inheritance would become one of history's most famous medical mysteries. Tutankhamun, the boy king's hidden agony. The world knows Tutankhamun as the Golden Pharaoh, the boy whose tomb survived intact to dazzle the modern age with its treasures. What the world couldn't know until 21st century DNA technology made it visible, was that Tutankhamun spent his entire short life in constant physical pain. The genetic analysis was devastating in its clarity. Tutankhamun's father was Akhenaten. His mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters, a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose genetic contribution sealed her son's fate. This brother-sister union produced a child so damaged that walking became an ordeal requiring assistance. The tomb contained 130 walking sticks. When archaeologists first found them, they assumed these were ceremonial objects, symbols of pharaonic authority. They were wrong. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy revealed the truth: a severe club foot that twisted his left foot inward at an agonizing angle, a cleft palate that would have affected his speech and breathing, a curved spine that forced him into a permanent hunch. The walking sticks weren't symbols. They were survival tools for a teenager who could barely stand without support, but the genetic damage went deeper than bone and cartilage. Tutankhamun suffered from Kolar disease, a rare condition where bone tissue in the foot literally dies, starved of blood supply. Every step would have sent jolts of pain through his malformed leg. Modern doctors who've studied his remains describe it as one of the most painful orthopedic conditions a person can endure, and Tutankhamun lived with it from childhood until his death at 19. His immune system, weakened by inbreeding depression, left him vulnerable to infections that a healthy person would have fought off. DNA analysis found malaria parasites in his bones, the earliest confirmed case of the disease in human history. But malaria didn't kill him outright. It was the combination: the malaria, the genetic disorders, and finally a broken leg that became infected, that his compromised immune system couldn't heal. Tutankhamun married his half-sister Ankhesenamun, continuing the cycle that had destroyed him. Their 2 children were stillborn, tiny bodies buried with their father, genetic analysis revealing birth defects so severe that survival outside the womb was impossible. The boy king's line ended with him, another royal family consumed by its own genetic isolation. The Ptolemaic calculation, Greek rulers, Egyptian obsession. When Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy claimed Egypt after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, he established a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. But the Ptolemies took Egyptian traditions of royal incest and transformed them into systematic policy with a calculated ruthlessness that even ancient observers found shocking. This wasn't occasional cousin marriage for political convenience. Starting with Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II, the dynasty practiced methodical sibling marriage generation after generation. Brothers married sisters as standard procedure, and their children married their own siblings in turn, creating what geneticists now recognize as one of the most extreme inbreeding programs in recorded history. The Ptolemies weren't ignorant about what they were doing. They were Greek, educated in Hellenic philosophy and science, ruling over a sophisticated civilization. They understood that this practice was unusual, that it violated Greek cultural norms, but they made a calculated decision. Genetic health mattered less than concentrated power. By marrying only each other, they ensured that no outsider could claim Egyptian wealth or influence through royal marriage. The cost would be paid in flesh. Ptolemy VIII, who ruled intermittently from 170 to 116 BCE, showed the world that cost in vivid, grotesque detail. His nickname was Fiscon, fatty, and it wasn't an exaggeration. Contemporary accounts describe a man so obese that he could barely move, his belly protruding in ways that suggested not mere overeating but profound metabolic dysfunction. His neck was swollen with what appears to have been a massive goiter. His eyes bulged from their sockets in the characteristic pattern of thyroid disease. But the physical deformity was only part of the horror. Ptolemy VIII was paranoid, violent, prone to sudden rages that ended in mass executions. Historical records describe him ordering the deaths of Alexandrian intellectuals, engaging in family feuds that left relatives murdered or exiled, terrorizing his own court with unpredictable brutality. Modern psychiatrists who've studied his documented behavior recognize the pattern, not just personality disorder, but the kind of cognitive and emotional damage that severe inbreeding can produce. He married his sister Cleopatra II, then added his niece Cleopatra III as a second wife, creating overlapping relationships that produced children whose family trees looked more like tangled vines than branches. Many of these children died young. The survivors bore the genetic markers that had become standard in the Ptolemaic line: metabolic disorders, mental instability, bodies that seemed to wage war against themselves. The Habsburg inheritance, dynasties built on accumulated damage. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't invent royal inbreeding, but they perfected it with a dedication that bordered on religious fervor. When the House of Habsburg took control of Spain in 1516, they brought with them a marriage philosophy that would define, and ultimately destroy, their dynasty. Blood stays with blood, no matter the cost. Charles IV of Spain, also known as Holy Roman Emperor Charles I, seemed at first like an unlikely candidate for a story about genetic catastrophe. Born in 1500, he inherited the largest empire in European history: Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, southern Italy, vast territories in the Americas. He was intelligent, politically astute, seemingly capable. But look at his portraits closely, and the warning signs emerge. Antonio Mubetis, an Italian diplomat who met Charles in 1517, wrote a description that has haunted historians ever since. A long, cadaverous face and a lopsided mouth which drops open when he is not on his guard. Charles had inherited what would become known as the Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism, a protruding lower jaw that made proper mouth closure difficult. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.038, relatively low for what would follow, but already higher than what any geneticist would consider safe. The tragedy wasn't Charles himself, it was his choice of bride. Despite ruling an empire that spanned continents, despite having access to potential wives from across Europe, Charles married his first cousin Isabel of Portugal. Isabel's mother was Charles's aunt, his father's sister. The papal dispensation required for such a close union acknowledged that even the Catholic Church recognized this was pushing biological boundaries. Their son Philip II inherited not just Spain at the zenith of its power, but a concentrated dose of Habsburg genetic damage that would shape everything about his reign. Philip exhibited the classic Habsburg features from birth: the elongated face, the hooded eyes, the increasingly prominent jaw that made eating difficult and speaking unclear. But his inheritance went beyond physical deformity. Modern historians believe Philip suffered from severe depression and possible autism spectrum disorders. His approach to governance reflected the mental rigidity that often accompanies inbreeding depression. He became fixated on religious orthodoxy, launching Inquisition persecutions with unprecedented brutality. He spent hours crafting single letters while crucial strategic decisions languished. His advisors reported watching him rewrite diplomatic correspondence multiple times, obsessing over word choices while his empire's rivals outmaneuvered him on every front. Philip married 4 times in desperate pursuit of male heirs. His first wife was his cousin Maria of Portugal. Their mothers were sisters. For his 4th and final marriage, he returned to family tradition with a vengeance. He married his niece Anna of Austria, his brother's daughter, a woman 22 years his junior. Their union produced Philip III, whose genetic damage would make his father look healthy by comparison. The accelerating decline. When bodies begin to fail. Philip III, born in 1578, represented a critical threshold. His inbreeding coefficient was so high that modern geneticists consider his survival to adulthood remarkable in itself. Contemporary accounts describe a man with the mental capacity of a child, physically weak, utterly dependent on advisors to make even basic decisions. His jaw protruded so severely that closing his mouth became impossible. He drooled constantly. His food had to be pre-cut into pieces small enough that he could swallow them whole because chewing was beyond his capability. His speech was nearly incomprehensible, slurred by his malformed mouth and oversized tongue. Court visitors who met him for the first time often struggled to hide their shock. But perhaps more tragic than his physical deformities were his mental limitations. Philip III was described by contemporaries as having childlike comprehension, deeply religious but in a superstitious way that suggested cognitive impairment rather than genuine spirituality. He left the actual governing of Spain to a series of favorites who exploited his weakness for their own enrichment, while the empire hemorrhaged territory and wealth. He married Margaret of Austria, another cousin, and their children represented the next stage in the Habsburg genetic experiment. Their son, the future Philip IV, would inherit an even more concentrated dose of family defects. Philip IV ruled Spain for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. Diego Velázquez's portraits show us exactly what those years looked like. The Habsburg features taken to an extreme: the protruding jaw, the elongated skull, eyes that seemed to stare with vacant incomprehension at a world he couldn't quite grasp. Philip IV suffered from what we would now recognize as major depressive disorder, with possible psychotic features. Court records describe periods lasting weeks when the king would remain in his chambers, refusing visitors, sometimes talking to paintings as if they were real people. During these episodes, he became convinced that courtiers were plotting against him, that foreign powers were using witchcraft to destroy Spain, that God was punishing him personally for sins he couldn't identify. The pressure to produce a male heir consumed him. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, a cousin, bore several children who died in infancy or childhood. Only one daughter survived to adulthood, but females couldn't inherit the Spanish throne. When Isabella died in 1644, Philip faced an existential crisis. He needed a male heir, but his genetic inheritance made healthy childbearing increasingly unlikely. His solution followed family tradition with horrifying logic. He married his niece Mariana of Austria, his brother's daughter, making their union one of the closest blood relationships in Habsburg history. The marriage produced several children, most of whom died young. And then in 1661 came a son who would become the final terrible proof of what 16 generations of inbreeding could create: Charles II, the breaking point. Charles II of Spain was born on November 6, 1661, with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than the typical child of siblings. From birth, every person who saw him knew that something was catastrophically wrong. French court records, written by observers who had no reason to exaggerate, described an infant with herpes-type rashes covering his body, a head covered in scabs, and a kind of channel or drainage that oozes from the right ear. There were whispers that his sexual organs were so malformed that courtiers couldn't initially determine his gender. Charles never learned to walk properly. His legs were weak and twisted. His spine curved in ways that made him appear hunched even as a child. He didn't speak his first words until age 4, and even then his speech was so distorted that only his closest attendants could decipher it. The famous Habsburg jaw reached its absolute peak in Charles II. His lower mandible protruded so far that he couldn't close his mouth or chew solid food. Meals became ordeals that court physicians described as distressing to witness. His mental capacity was profoundly limited. He couldn't read or write beyond a basic level, struggled to understand simple concepts, often seemed confused about where he was or what was happening around him. Contemporary accounts describe him as having the mental development of a young child, trapped in an aging, failing body. The Spanish court called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, because they couldn't conceive that someone could be so damaged without supernatural intervention. They subjected him to constant exorcisms, religious ceremonies intended to drive out the demons they believed possessed him. The priests meant well, but they were fighting genetics with prayer. trying to cure with holy water what generations of Habsburg marriage policy had created. Charles II married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was reportedly so repulsed by his appearance and behavior that she avoided being alone with him. Court observers noted that she would visibly flinch when he tried to speak. The marriage produced no children. After her death in 1689, Charles married Maria Anna of Neuburg. This second marriage was equally childless. Charles's genetic damage had made him physically incapable of reproduction. He died on November 1st, 1700, just days before his 39th birthday. The autopsy report has survived, and it makes for devastating reading. His body contained a single testicle, black as coal, intestines that were putrefied and gangrenous, a heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs corroded, and a head full of water. This wasn't just the description of a sick man. This was the documentation of a genetic catastrophe, the final accounting of what happens when power refuses to recognize biological reality.